My name is Robert Farthing. I'm the Division Manager of the Business Processing section, and I will be sharing with you today some basic information about filing for Illinois business income tax. We will begin by looking at filing requirements. Then we'll take some time to look at the relatively new pass-through entity tax. And finally, we want to touch on some common mistakes made which cause delays in the processing of business tax returns. Let's begin with the requirements for filing each type of business income tax return. As you can see, the chart here shows that each return type has an original return due date and an automatic extended due date. Rather than go through each one individually, I encourage you to see the form instructions for specifics about the due date of the return. Next slide, please. For all business return types, full payment is due at the time of the original due date of the return. This is true even if the return is not filed until the extended due date. Additionally, estimated payments are required for income tax liabilities of $400 or more on an IL 1120. These quarterly payments are due on the 15th days of the 4th, 6th, 9th, and 12th months of the tax year. For those electing to pay pass-through entity tax on an IL 1120 ST or an IL 1065 return, estimated payments are due for a tax liability of $500 or more. As we go to the next slide, we'll begin talking about the pass-through entity tax. S corporations and partnerships may now elect to pay pass-through entity tax for their partners and shareholders. PTE tax is an amount equal to 4.95% of the taxpayer's calculated net income for the taxable year. Once reported and paid, a PTE tax credit is then distributed to each partner and shareholder on Schedule K1P for the portion equal to the amount of PTE tax paid by the partnership or S corporation. Let's continue, please. It should be noted that once made, the election to pay PTE tax is irrevocable. In order to make the PTE tax election, you'll select box I on the 1065 or box L on the 1120 ST, as shown here. Additionally, those taxpayers making the PTE election may choose to annualize their income by checking box J on the 1065 or box M on the 1120 ST. Next slide, please. Pass-through entity income is reported by the lower tier entity on both the 1065 and 1120 ST on line 60. Then the PTE tax is calculated and reported on line 61, as you can see highlighted here on the screen. Please note that if the PTE election is made, there should be no pass-through withholding reported on line 59. You may either pay withholding or you may pay pass-through entity tax, but you may not do both. Next slide. When a lower tier entity reports pass-through entity tax, a Schedule B will also need to be completed. You will list the total amount of PTE credit being distributed on Section A, line 6. The distributed amount for each partner shareholder should be reported on line K in Section B, as shown here. Next slide. When you are distributing a pass-through entity tax credit, a Schedule K1P must be issued to that partner and shareholder. For the amount which was reported on Schedule B, Section B, line K, should be carried over to the K1P for that partner shareholder. The amount is reported on line 53A of the K1P, as you can see highlighted here. Next slide. For tax year 2022, we've added the ability for a middle tier entity to report pass-through entity credit amounts, which are received, but are simply flowing through to a higher tier. What you'll do is you'll list the total amount of PTE credit received, but also being distributed, on line 7 of Schedule B, Section A. Then the amount received and distributed for each partner shareholder should be reported in Section B, line L, as you can see here. Next page. There's an additional thing we want to note here regarding middle tier entities. The received and distributed amount that you've reported on line 7 should not be included in the reported pass-through entity tax amount on line 61 of your main return. This is because the amount received and distributed is just flowing through. It's not being paid by the middle tier entity. For further instructions, please see the worksheet for the form that you are filing, either the 1065 or the 1120ST. Let's continue as we look at the highest tier entity. The high tier entity will receive a K1P or a K1T, and it will be allowed to claim the pass-through entity credits that have been passed to them. These credits may be claimed on the line specified on the main return as shown here. Note that the correct line will be identified as pass-through entity tax credit reported on a K1P or a K1T. You can see that highlighted here on an 1120 or a 1040 as shown here. But there will also be a line on the 1041 or the 990T that are comparable. Now you should know everything that there is to know about pass-through entity tax. However, if you do have questions, and I'm sure that there will be, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to answer those questions. Now I'd like to move on to some common mistakes and share with you those common mistakes which are made by business income tax filers. By avoiding these mistakes, you will also avoid delays in processing your return. First of all, we often see returns filed on the incorrect form for the filing period that is being filed. This is especially true for fiscal year ending filers. If you're filing a fiscal year ending return, be sure to use the form which has the previous year printed on the top of the form, as you can see here circled in red. Do not make changes to the form itself to make it appear correct. Forms which are not prescribed by the department will be considered invalid, and using the incorrect form will cause processing delays on your return. Next slide, please. We also often see common mistakes made on the additions and subtractions sections of the return. For example, if you have an addition that's on a K1P or a K1T, that must be brought over to the main return as an addition. Also, when you're reporting an addition or a subtraction from a K1P or a K1T, be sure that it is being reported on the correct line of the schedule or the return where it should be reported. For example, the Schedule M, line 35, other subtractions, is generally not where you should place a subtraction and report it. There's usually another line on the return which is appropriate for that subtraction. The only allowable subtraction for Schedule M, line 35 is specifically listed in Publication 101. Another subtraction that we often see errors is related to Schedule J, foreign dividends. We do require a copy of the federal Schedule C or equivalent as support for that subtraction. So please include that with your return to prevent delays with your return. Next slide, please. We also see common mistakes in the apportionment section of the return. First of all, when you are reporting any income or loss outside of Illinois, you must complete all 3 apportionment lines of the return. the total sales, the total Illinois sales, and the apportionment factor. When completing apportionment, you should also not have negative sales or negative sales factors. This includes the Schedule UB and the subgroup schedule. Any special apportionment methods must be approved by the department. Be sure to verify that the Schedule UB and the subgroup schedule are in agreement with your main return. Next slide. When it comes to Schedule K1P or K1T, we will only accept schedules which have been issued to the taxpayer. An estimated schedule is considered invalid. Make sure that you have an actual K1P and not one which has been estimated. When issuing the Schedule K1P or K1T to your partners and shareholders, be sure that the amounts shown on the correspond to the amounts reported on your Schedule B for each partner or shareholder, or on Schedule D for each beneficiary. As we continue, we'll look at some payment problems. Another part of the return which causes problems for taxpayers is often the payment section. The payment line of the return is only intended to report payments made prior to the filing of the return. We ask you not to include on the line payments which are made together with the return. When making a payment, please allow 15 days for the payment to post to the account. We will always honor the date the payment is received, regardless of when it is shown as posted on our system. In order to help us post your payment correctly, please be sure to include the FEIN for the filing period and the filing period on both the check and the payment voucher that you are sending with the payment. Let's talk about amended returns. When filing an amended return, we also ask you to make sure you're filing the correct form. Just like an original return should be on the correct form, we ask that the amended return also be on the correct form. You will file an amended return using the form which has an X at the end of the form. For example, Form IL 1120X. When making a federal change on an amended return, we do require a federal finalization date before we can process that amended return. So be sure to include this when you file your amended return. Finally, as we close out, we want to talk about some quick tips for resolving problems. Number one thing that we ask is that you respond to any notice that you receive from the department in a timely manner. The longer it takes you to respond, the longer it will take us to resolve your problems. Secondly, when you do respond, we ask that you include a copy of the notice that you received from the department. This will help us make sure that we're resolving the problem that you are trying to resolve. Finally, we want to remind you that we are here to serve you, and we're here to help you resolve the problems with your accounts. Sometimes it doesn't happen quickly, but we will work with you until we can come to a resolution that will work. Thank you very much for your time.